I'm Jim English. I'm a professor in the English department, and I am the director of the Wolf Humanities Center. I want to thank you all for coming today. This is a nice, robust audience. I want to thank also the Classics Department and the chair, Peter Struck, for joining us as partners to co-sponsor Professor Hall's address. I should thank Dick and Noelle Wolf and our other generous donors. I will say that they're a lot more generous than our other donors, but they can afford to be. And also I want to say thanks to our deans, Steve Fluharty and Jeff Kahlberg. I was just out in California at another university, and my friends on the humanities faculty there were complaining that their administration sort of hostile to them, or at least does not get them at all, doesn't really see how they compute on the metrics of impact, except as, you know, unwanted expenditures. And this is not an unusual situation, but we've been lucky here in the School of Arts and Sciences. We've been really well led by true scholars who believe in broad liberal arts education. The former dean, Rebecca Bushnell, is here. She oversaw the founding of the Humanities Center, Humanities Forum, as we then called it, and its steady growth over the years. And Steve and Jeff have continued with that support. So we're in good shape here. As I near the end of my term as director, we're a thriving enterprise, a lot of people involved. We've got big plans and bright prospects for the future. And we do make an impact on the campus and the community, and we're glad that the deans appreciate that. Anyway, as I said, this is the third event in the Afterlives series. We have a fantastic speaker coming up as well next week. You might have seen on the board, I'll just mention, the celebrated anthropologist Alma Gottlieb is coming. She's going to talk about her fieldwork on child rearing in West Africa and the interesting set of beliefs around babies and afterlives and spirituality that she's written about. So I hope to see some of you here next week for that event as well. The topic director for our Afterlives program is Emily Wilson. There are a number of classicists here, and for them, Emily really needs no introduction at all. But for the rest of you, I'll just say Emily is a professor of classical Greek. She's chair of the program in comparative literature. Her published books and articles and her teaching span the history of tragedy and epic from the ancients to the late Renaissance. She's responsible for translating plays of Euripides and Seneca, and her brilliant, brisk, and bracing translation of Homer's Odyssey, which I've been reading. I have an advanced copy. That's the first ever into English by a woman translator, and it will be available in the shops in just a couple of weeks. So who better to introduce Professor Edith Hall? Please join me in a round of applause for Emily Wilson, who will do the intro.
So thank you all for being here for what I hope will be a stimulating and provocative talk on the future of the human race from Edith Hall. I'm delighted and honored to welcome our guest speaker today, Professor Edith Hall, who's an extremely distinguished, influential classicist whose work covers an impressively wide range of interests within the broad field of ancient Greek literature and culture and its reception in modern times. She has particularly deep, abiding interests in drama, including tragedy, comedy, and pantomime, and in the subaltern or marginalized social groups of classical Athens, especially the slaves, who made up a large percentage of ancient Athenian population, and the people defined by the Greeks as foreigners or barbarians. They can only say bar, bar, bar. They can't talk properly. Her first book was a groundbreaking study of the representation of barbarians in Greek tragedy. That work laid out the foundation for some of her later career, in that it was seriously engaged with ancient Greek drama, and it brought the insights of cultural studies, ethnography, and anthropology into the conversation with literary texts, in ways that hadn't exactly been done before, but then became part of the new normal in classical studies. She's continued to be a very prolific and formative scholar in the field for almost 30 years, Scholars of Greek drama, Greek cultural studies, and reception studies are all extremely grateful and indebted to her work. She's published over 20 books, including monographs, editions of classical texts, and collections of essays. So obviously I'm not going to talk about all of those 20 in any detail, though in fact all of them deserve it. I just want to highlight two elements of her work that I think have a bearing on her talk today. One is that she's been a leader in bringing the insights of classical scholarship to a wider, including non-academic, audience. Several of her works, including the excellent 2014 book from Norton, Introducing the Ancient Greeks, aim to give non-specialists a lively, up-to-date, nuanced introduction to the field. And it's a field which has often prided itself in the past on being exclusive, and Edith shows how the field can be opened up. She's engaged wide audiences with many appearances on television and radio, and through her successful blog. Plenty of classicists are still snooty about what they call outreach, as if there was no point in talking to the lowly people who can't read Aeschylus in the original. Edith Hall is not like that, and she's been a very important voice in bringing a nuanced understanding of classical antiquity to a wider public, and showing, as I hope her talk today will also show, how and why the Greeks might matter to all of us. The second thing I wanted to emphasize is that her work ties in beautifully with our theme this year of Afterlives, which is one of many reasons why I'm so happy that she's able to come here today. Again, some classicists still believe that we can study the past as if it existed in a hermetically sealed box. There's just the past, and we're just going to leapfrog over everything that happened in between, everything that we are, into somehow getting the truth about that box. Edith's rich and varied work on reception has demonstrated how essential it is to look at ancient literature, ancient culture, in dialogue with its post-classical receptions, and to think about how our own contemporary vantage point can influence our insights into the past and can shape our insights. And also how cultural vantage points, both in antiquity and today, can be different depending on gender, ethnicity, social class. Her work in this area includes a wonderful volume on the influence of Greek drama on post-classical theatre, an excellent book on the reception of the Odyssey, another excellent study of the much less canonical Euripides play, Iphigenia in Tauris. She's also co-edited an important collection on ancient and post-classical slavery, and last year she produced an edited volume on women classical studies scholars. Edith Hall's work has been very important to me personally, and I feel deeply grateful to her for bringing new insights into the afterlives of the ancient Greeks, and showing that they're less dead than we might think, or maybe less dead than we might hope. I'm very much looking forward to her talk today. I hope you join me in welcoming her to Penn and to the Wolf Humanities Centre.
Well, that was dramatic. It's Halloween coming up. Thank you very much, Emily, and thank you very much to the Penn Humanities Centre, everybody who's been involved in organising my visit here. I'm having a really brilliant time, and intend today's talk really to be a bit of a morale boost. We're not doing so well politically in my country either, but I have to say, after an afternoon of watching Sarah Huckabee Sanders on MSNBC, I think we all need a few smiles. I mean, I thought America was the land of artificial smiles, and I would give anything for just one really full smile from that woman, but still. So, we are all members of communities which extend beyond our families and close friends. And our happiness is partly dependent on whether we're at ease with the huge groups, the fellow citizens in our own nations and the citizens of other nations across the planet, which make up the wider world. It can be very hard to work out our responsibilities as members of groups, especially in times of political turbulence or when we simply don't agree with the policies of the governments under which we're living. A big problem is a feeling of helplessness in the face of large-scale troubles and international problems like the environmental crisis. And this often leads into a desire for a retreat into private life and escapist recreation. Now, Aristotle, who I'm taking as the sum total of all the wisdom accrued by the ancient Greeks by the 4th century BC, and whose worldview I still believe, I believe is, again, one that we could all very usefully adopt in order to figure out how to make relationships with each other, with our groups, and with the world. And I have written a book coming out on May the 1st with Penguin and Penguin USA, which will expand on why I think we should all be Aristotelians now. He would have understood our problems. He'd himself lived in times and places where it was dangerous to oppose the ruling powers. In Macedon, Philip II ran affairs as a ruthless autocrat, and in Athens, even though it was a democracy, Aristotle was always an outsider, a resident alien without the rights of a full Athenian citizen. And he must have felt tempted to turn his back on political issues altogether and retire to his very large personal library. And yet he did not. He continued to teach his students and give lectures to the ordinary Athenian public at the Lyceum, his university. Now, most unfortunately, these accessibly expressed public lectures, which he called his exoteric works, like the opposite of esoteric, haven't survived. And this means that his example of keeping up a constant dialogue with ordinary people about his findings has been completely effaced. And I'm sure that this loss has contributed to the terrible gap which yawns between academia and public understanding in the modern Western world, and which initiatives such as this are laudably attempting to cross the divide. But above all, Aristotle continued to write about politics and the relationship of citizens to their wider human communities, and even very much, as I'm going to say today, to the natural world. Now, one of the most important distinctions he ever drew between humans and other animals, and he was very, very interested in what, if anything, made us more advanced as animals, is that while some animals have memory, only humans, as far as we know, can deliberate and practice recollection, and practice disciplined recollection of things that have happened in the past in our own lives, which allows us to make better decisions. So mnemosine, or mneme, is memory, and dogs have memory, as he points out. Pavlov's dog, whoever, if you take your dog for a walk, it will probably try and take the same walk the next day. But a dog cannot sit down and think about all the times he's been out for a walk with that particular person and decide how to behave by calculating that. And what I've been trying to work on, because people say Aristotle had no sense of history or he wasn't a proper historian, but I actually think that the disciplined use of recollection, if magnified to the level of Homo sapiens, is actually what everybody does in a university. That is what certainly people in humanities do, is the disciplined use of recollection to find lessons from the past which help us deliberate about the future. So Aristotelian recollection, amnesis, which is much more interesting to me than Platonic recollection, which is all about reincarnation and memories of previous lives. Aristotelian amnesis is about recollection of the lives of you as yourself and of other humans, seems to be much more practically useful. But before I go any further, I need to address the most contentious issue in any attempt to revive Aristotelian philosophy in applied ethics today, and that is his prejudiced nature of his views as a prosperous ancient patriarch and householder on women and slaves. In the first book of his Politics, he notoriously defends slavery, at least in the case of Greeks enslaving non-Greeks, and states unequivocally that women are cerebrally inferior to men. Now, my answer to this is to stress Aristotle's unusual consistency in arguing that all opinions must always be open to revision. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he writes that even though steadfastness is essentially a virtue, there are times when it can be damaging to adhere to fixed opinions. If you receive evidence and arguments that your opinion is wrong, then changing your mind, which some people might condemn as inconstancy, is essential. We might just need to question whether everything the Founding Fathers said really is what we want to think about today. I know that that's not necessarily what everybody in this country wants to think. He cites the case of Neoptolemus in the Philoctetes, a tragedy of Sophocles. Now, Neoptolemus had been persuaded by Odysseus, a powerful authority figure in the army, to lie to the lame, sick Philoctetes. But when Neoptolemus sees Philoctetes suffering and learns more information, he changes his mind and refuses to participate in the deception. He revises his opinion. And I believe that if we could talk to Aristotle, we could indeed persuade him to revise his opinion both of slavery and of the female brain. For Aristotle, the fundamental question, who is allowed to be a political agent, is always and must always be open to question. And in his Politics, he says that revising ideas has proved beneficial in all other fields of knowledge. For example, medicine, he says, has been proved by being altered from the ancestral systems and gymnastic training and all the arts and faculties. He looks at early history to show how old opinions and practices are abandoned when humans climb the ladder of progress. He says, one might argue the laws of ancient times were too simple and barbaric. The Greeks, he says, used to carry arms and purchase their wives from one another. Now, although he thinks traditional opinions, endoxa, need to be taken seriously and any refutation argued systematically, he has very little time for the argument that anything is good just because it's inherited from our ancestors. He believes that primitive humans were just like the less sophisticated people in his own day, so it's very odd, he says, we should necessarily abide by their notions. It's impossible, he writes, that the structure of the state can have been framed correctly for all time in relation to all the details. The effective creation of happiness, eudaimonia for Aristotle, cannot be done alone. Humans flourish optimally when they live in association with other humans and animals and engage in reciprocal good deeds. His idea of friendliness, friendship, the friendly attitude between citizens is one which I think we need to stick to particularly hard when higher powers are trying to divide us. The Aristotelian attitude towards other citizens seems to me unbelievably important. Now, he much likes the custom of placing a shrine of the three graces prominently in a public place to remind people, he says, to return a kindness. That is a special characteristic of charis, grace, since it is a duty for a citizen not only to repay a service done to you, but at another time to take the initiative in doing one yourself. It's quite insufficient in Aristotelian virtue ethics merely to respond to friendly overtures. You need to be a self-starter to initiate and foster cooperation. And the graces function as goddesses of reciprocity in social relationships. 3 in number, they often hold hands in a circle, precisely because 3 marks the magical moment when a simple two-way relationship breaks out into the complex set of transactions forming society. This mirrors the flow of mutual assistance around human communities in a virtuous circle. Aristotle builds the argument that all human society is grounded in one type of unit, the natural partnership or friendship which exists between spouses, between members of a household, between friends beyond the household, and between fellow citizens. People in all these categories can be counted as friends bound by affection. It's just to varying degrees. Relationships with fellow citizens are a form of usefulness friendship, he calls them utility friendships, which require goodwill, reciprocity, and trust. City-states malfunction, he says, when there are no friendly partnerships in operation between the individuals who constitute the state. And a trenchant account of the potential degradation of all relationships in a malfunctioning state was published in Agamemnon's Daughter by Ismail Kadare. And in this novel, Kadare uses the sacrifice of the heroine in Euripides' tragedy Iphigenia and Aulis, a play in which Aristotle was incredibly interested himself. And he uses this as a paradigm for its effect in the early 1980s of the dehumanizing regime in Albania and the moral degeneracy that affects any population ruled by an unruly and unaccountable government. Kadari shows how everyone is in danger of losing their moral compass when terror is the dominant psychological register. Each day, he writes, we felt the cogs and wheels of collective guilt pushing us further down. We were obliged to make a stand, make accusations, and fling mud at people, at ourselves in the first place, then at everyone else. It was a truly diabolical mechanism, because once you've debased yourself, it's easy to sully everything around you. Every day, every hour that passed, stripped more flesh from moral values. Aristotle's ideal state is exactly the opposite. It's the magnification of the primary relationships of love within and between households, which bind humans working towards living well in the pursuit of happiness. And Jefferson had read Aristotle. Good government of a city-state, aiming at the happiness of citizens, requires a foundation of these friendships between citizens and will promote in them civic concord. And it's not a matter of a passionate affiliation to a political party or a subgroup of citizens, an unfluctuating attitude towards all the other individuals constituting your state. And this is an attitude which can never be overridden by private religious beliefs, for example. And Aristotle is very clear that tyrants often use religion to keep people in a state of suppression. Concord comprises both goodwill and a commitment to reciprocal responsibility, and you can carry on having that commitment even if other people don't. Its aim is to secure what is expedient for everybody in a morally conscientious way. There will always be citizens, unfortunately, Aristotle says, who cannot sign up to the project of civic concord any more than they can make serious friendships in their personal lives, since, he says, they try to get more than their share of advantages and take less than their share of work and public burdens. He stresses that citizens who only love themselves and take more than their fair share of community assets are rightly censured. Moreover, a man cannot expect to make money out of the community and to receive its respect as well. People do not try to make money out of their friends. Aristotle's emphasis on fellow citizenship as a species of friendship underlies his sense that there was a size beyond which happy city-states couldn't grow. He speaks with amazed disapproval of Babylon, so large that when it was captured, a considerable part of the city was not aware of it 3 days later. Overpopulation, he says, leads to poverty, which is destructive. One lawgiver at Corinth, he mentions, argued that the best policy is to maintain the same numbers across time. Brought up in a moderate-sized, independent city-state, he believes that there is actually a natural limit to the size of a civic community which functions well, just like a ship. A ship needs to be neither too small nor too big because it will stop functioning socially effectively either way. And thinking about the health of a political community from the perspective of the individual relationships underpinning it offers him a new way to think about constitutions. He offers a measured comparison of the 4 different types of constitution in ancient Greece: democracy, tyranny, aristocracy, and monarchy. This comparative discussion is rightly incredibly famous and has had an incalculable influence on political thought and practice. The very vocabulary of our European political theory, as we practice it today, was born at the moment when his politics was first translated into modern languages, and it's been appropriated by advocates of all of these constitutional models. A month after the execution of Charles I in January 1649, John Milton's The Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, which justifies regicide where the king has made himself answerable only to God, uses Aristotle's definition in the Politics. But his harshest criticisms by far are directed at tyrannies, which he says discourage any activities amongst citizens which foster self-esteem and self-confidence. And those are his words. These activities, tellingly, include the work of philosophers such as he and Aristotle. He says the formation of study circles and other conferences for debate, those are the ones that tyrants suppress. Most of us today wouldn't happily tolerate living under any form of constitution which suppressed self-education or debate, or indeed under any constitution other than a democracy. And today, just over half the world lives in electoral democracies. Yet by Aristotle's ethical criteria, many of these supposed electoral democracies accept thoroughly bad behavior on a grand scale. Most estimates the proportion of humans living today in countries which respect basic human rights and the rule of law at less than 40%. Aristotle's response to regimes which use torture in an attempt to elicit information is this: stop, because it doesn't work. And most ancient Greeks thought it did. As he stated coolly in his rhetoric, those being subjected to torture are as likely to give false evidence as true, some being ready to endure everything rather than tell the truth, others equally ready to make false charges in the hope of being released from torture. Such common sense. The many problems associated with democracy do not, however, elude his notice. In a passage which speaks loud across the centuries, he acknowledges that where the political class includes many workers, the regulation of property ownership causes discontent. For, if both in the employment of the produce and in the work of production they end up not equal but unequal, complaints are bound to arise between those who enjoy or take much but work little, and those who take less but work more. He soberly concludes that these are very, very difficult problems. Yet he chose to live in Athens for more than 3 decades of his adult life, even as a resident alien, and therefore he cannot have found the democratic system all that inimical. He speaks with less disapproval of democracy than any other system, and he says that the goal of democracy is liberty, whereas with oligarchy it's wealth, for aristocrats it's high culture and obedience, and for tyrants it's self-protection. He points out that the constitution with by far the most scope for friendship and justice between ruler and subjects is democracy, where the citizens, being equal, have many things in common. The constitution which is most hostile to friendship, however, and justice between citizens is tyranny. And Aristotle also thinks that democracies can easily degenerate into tyranny. And this is something we seem to be seeing in a lot of countries of the world, Turkey, where people keep voting in people who will actually lessen their rights. But the mass electorate, empowered in a democracy, he thinks potentially comes to far better decisions than the small numbers of rulers involved in all the other types of constitution. And he can beautiful simile. He compares the decision taken by the masses to the type of public feast to which many different citizens contribute different dishes. This will inevitably, he says, be better than a dinner provided by any single host. When citizens come together to judge legal cases or deliberate, just as the multitude becomes a single person with many feet and many hands and many senses, so it also becomes one personality as regards the moral and intellectual faculties. Well, we'll return to this idea later, but just observe here Aristotle's recommendation that in the ideal democracy, all citizens actively participate in government. And in Athens, this was absolutely possible and actually happened through the institution of the subsidy of citizen participation in the advisory council, boule. Almost every male citizen had to sit on this for a whole year and know as much as a congressperson. And it's incredibly important, he says, that people are made actively to involve themselves. Now, most people here will be able to take relative political stability in their own state for granted. But as I said, at least half the planet's population can't. Aristotle has been recuperated recently by political theorists as a utopian because he imagines the possibility that everyone alive will one day be able to realize their potential and make full use of all their faculties. And that's the distinctive Aristotelian principle, according to American political philosopher John Rawls. Aristotle even imagines a futuristic world when technological advances would make human labor, and therefore, in his own historical context, slavery, completely unnecessary. He remembers the mythical craftsmen Daedalus and Hephaestus, who constructed robots which could move and work to order, obviating the need for servants. If shuttles he says, could weave and plectrums strum, master craftsmen would have no need of assistants and masters no need of slaves. It really is almost as if he'd anticipated modern developments in artificial intelligence. But his utopian political theory is very flexible. And this is why I think it's something that is very practicable in our modern world. You can be a capitalist, a socialist, a businesswoman, a charity worker, vote for almost any political party, and still be a consistent Aristotelian. Because he emphasized that social structures are only as stable if they accommodate human nature, he's actually sometimes been a pin-up boy of conservatives. He's praised in Benjamin Weiker's 10 books every conservative must read. But Aristotelian capitalists need to be of the kind who will not tolerate poverty amongst their fellow citizens. Aristotle knows that humans come into conflict when commodities are scarce, but he acknowledges the basic laws still underlying modern capitalism. He's the first ancient Greek author to explain the meaning of a monopoly, use that particular word, and provide examples. His point is to refute people who say that philosophy is useless by proving that philosophers are capable of running highly successful businesses. It's just that they normally prefer to concentrate on other things. Thales, the founder of natural science, was, he says, taunted with the uselessness of philosophy. But from Thales' knowledge of astronomy, he'd observed when it was still winter, there was going to be a large crop of olives. So he raised a small sum of money, paid round deposits for all of the olive presses in Miletus and Chios, and then he hired them out at as low a rent because nobody was running him up. And when the season arrived, there was a sudden demand for a number of presses at the same time. By letting them out on what terms he liked, he realized a large sum of money, so proving it was easy for philosophers to be rich if they chose, but it's not what they actually did. By his insistence on grounding political theory in humanity's need to supply basic physical needs, he conceived by far the most advanced economic ideas ever to have appeared by his time. And this was the main reason why Karl Marx admired Aristotle so much, and why he's had a consistent following amongst radical political leftists, like Hugo Gellert, who, in his Karl Marx's Capital in lithographs, drew this beautiful picture of Aristotle. Aristotelian socialists, however, need to acknowledge that extending compulsory ownership to domestic accommodation just doesn't work. He's quite clear about that. Yet the Aristotelian socialists will be very pleased to find him condemning extreme poverty as a cause of conflict and crime, and taking seriously the radical view of a contemporary leveller called Phalias of Chalcedon. Phalias saw inequality in property as the universal cause of civil strife. He recommended that all citizens should own an identical amount of property. Now, although Aristotle doesn't agree with such extreme equalizing, he does cite, with apparent approval, the recommendation in Plato's Laws that no citizen should be allowed to own an estate worth more than 5 times that of the smallest one, 1 to 5. This, of course, is a degree of inequality so much lower than that tolerated under modern Western capitalism. On 7th of June 2016, when I was first researching this bit, Sir Martin Sorrell, who's chief executive of advertising group WPP, in Britain publicly defended his 70 million annual pay bonus. Now, that's not 5 times as much as his own warehouse worker, but 5,000 times as much. Aristotle also saw that economic uniformity might threaten the diversity of households, and he didn't want complete uniformity. He says that's like musical, making everybody play the same musical instrument or always sing in unison. But he did see that you couldn't have big differentials in wealth without having inbuilt conflict. So Aristotle's moral philosophy can be practiced within limits by people espousing right and left-wing political views. But it would, I believe, be impossible for a climate change denier to find any encouragement in Aristotle. And this, I think, for somewhere that celebrates the humanities and sciences, the arts and sciences, equally as any great academy will, Aristotle is the great role model for the 21st century university, because he is a natural scientist, a physicist, and a mathematician, as well as a brilliant expert on all branches of philosophy, political theory. He even invented the spreadsheet. We know that from the way he talks about volcanoes. He must have had some sort of primitive spreadsheet. As a natural scientist who believed in meticulous research based on repeated acts of empirical observation of what the world presents to him, tough phenomena, and rigorous examination of hypotheses, if Aristotle could visit our world today, he would be very alarmed at the weight of evidence of human-caused environmental damage. The detailed studies in his scientific works on the physical world and our place as living, breathing, embodied human creatures within it are also absolutely preconditions of his moral philosophy. The human being, as he always insisted, is simply an animal who lives in organized communities, a political animal, a zoon politikon. This passage was extraordinarily misquoted by Donald Trump in a crossfire with the Pope last year. By seeing humans as animals, if advanced ones, he effected a transformation in the ethical relationship between us and our material environment that has unlimited significance for us today. And as we become aware of the full extent of the damage we've inflicted as a species on the planet that we share with so many other living things, we can see that his scientific ideas are indeed fundamental to our project to obtain human fulfillment. I think he would have been appalled at the mess we've made of the world by a failure to take our responsibility to it and its non-human residents seriously. We're the only ones who can deliberate, so why aren't we doing it? His commitment to living planned lives in a deliberated way, taking long-term and total responsibility for our physical survival as well as our mental happiness, would, many scientists and classicists agree, make him an environmental campaigner today. All ecosystem approaches to ecology regularly use Aristotle's theories because they stress causality in the physical world and because his stress on the integrity and interaction of everything in the world is compatible with complex systems theory. Ecologists point to his beautiful description of the oneness and interconnectedness of nature, physis, in his metaphysics. All things in the universe, he says, are ordered together somehow, but not all alike. Fishes and fowls and plants. And the world is not such that one thing has nothing to do with another. They're connected. For all are ordered together to one end. All share the good of the whole. Plants, animals, and human beings exist in concentric circles of interdependence. Nature, he writes, proceeds little by little from things lifeless to animal life in such a way that it's impossible to determine the exact line of demarcation. And he's grasped the concept that climate can change over time and that environmental changes can threaten the human race. In his Meteorology, he speaks of the aging in the earth and the changes of land and sea in relation to one another. Whole races of humans, ethnoi, he says, have previously been destroyed before they'd been able to record what was happening to them. Over time, he says, for example, the land around Mycenae, had once beautifully moist and full of natural fountains, had become dry and barren. Now, Turkish political philosopher Özgür Orhan, who used to be at the University of Maryland, argues that the vision of the good implicit in the ecological critique of modern consumer society finds ultimate support in Aristotle's ideas not only about the workings of nature, but about humans' agency, since he always insisted that the purpose of ethical discourse is not simply knowing what is good, but putting it into practice, realizing it. Equally relevant to environmentalism is Aristotle's moral conception of economics. He says that business activity can be divided into two types. The first is natural, part of living well. People need things to live comfortably in their households. But this kind of business activity, he says, has inherent limits. since there is a point at which humans have access to sufficient goods to support pleasant existence. But the other type of business activity, which he sees as fundamentally unnatural, is bound by no limits whatsoever. And he could certainly be describing unbridled industrial capitalism and economic growth. His ecological relevance today lies, therefore, in his integral approach to a purposeful nature, combined with his concept of human agency and flourishing, based on virtue and, most importantly, limits to material accumulation. Indeed, says Orhan, the reckless environmental exploitation has its roots in nothing other than the modern age's rejection of Aristotelian philosophy. And his works on animals also display a disarming egalitarian tendency to express confidence in the judgment and observations of uneducated people, a confidence related to his conviction that the smart mob constituted by democracy, the hive mind, makes the best collective decisions. He reports what he's learned about the women islanders of Kos, who farm silk from the giant peacock moth, and its development through caterpillar and cocoon stages, when the women, he says, unwind and reel off the cocoons and weave a fabric with the threads unwound. The person who invented silk, he says, was from Kos, and she was called Pamphila. He's talked to hunters who've told him how they enchant deer through playing music to them. And as a colloquial term for the first short horns, he's learnt this word from the hunters, the little horns produced by young stags, and it compares them with the ancient Greek for clothes pegs. His detailed discussion of the hearing capacity of fish and their sense of taste have come into being through prolonged conversations with fishermen about the way they exploited noise, silence, and tasty bait to maximize their catches. He's chatted at the two Athenian harbours of Phaleron and Piraeus about different species of anchovy. He's learnt demotic nicknames which fishermen give to shellfish depending on their physical appearance or other attributes, like onion or stinky. Now, this would absolutely have appalled Plato. The head of the academy, with his august theory of the ideal forms, would have scoffed at his students' eloquent insistence that scientists should listen to ordinary individuals dealing with plants and animals in their everyday working lives, whether as hunters, farmers, or fishermen. Those, he says, who've lived in a more intimate communion with the phenomena of nature are better able to lay down such principles as be connected together. The most important lesson we can learn from Aristotelian science is about the human race's relationship with the rest of nature. Man shares, he says, his gregarious nature with some other animals, such as bees, wasps, ants, and cranes. Like humans, he says, some animals live under recognizable forms of government. Bees have rulers, for example. Some animals are nomads. Others settle and build permanently built houses and train their young to use their homes properly in the way of humans. He's especially enthralled here by the swallow. In the same way as men do, the bird mixes mud and chaff together. If it runs short of mud, it sounds its body in water and rolls about in the dry dust with wet feathers. Furthermore, just as man does, it makes a bed of straw, putting hard material below for a foundation and adapting all to suit its own size. Both parents cooperate in the rearing of the young. Each of the parents will detect with practiced eye the young one has had a helping and will take care it's not helped twice over. At first, the parents rid the nest of excrement, but as soon as the young are grown, they teach their young to shift their position and let their excrement fall over the side of the nest. There is a real animal lover's delight in this, in all his zoological works. And many sentences suggest to me that if he were alive today, like Sir Richard Attenborough, he would be making wonderful TV nature documentaries. It's very difficult to dislike a man who writes of a certain little species of wren that it's hardly larger than a locust, has a crest of bright red gold, and is every way a beautiful and graceful little bird. He advances very sophisticated theories about birds' migrations across the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, which must have required meticulous observation and probably spreadsheets. In some ways, he thinks birds are particularly close to Homo sapiens. We share with birds not only that we walk upright on two legs, but the faculty of uttering articulate sounds. He's interviewed bird catchers with expertise in different types of bird intelligence and with a lively turn of phrase. He describes the long-eared owl like this: a great rogue of a bird and a capital mimic. A bird catcher dances before it, and while the bird is mimicking his gestures, the accomplice comes behind and catches it. He's participated in an experimental drinking session with a talkative Indian parrot. By the way, after drinking wine, the parrot becomes more saucy than ever. And people say Aristotle doesn't have a personality. For him, humans are animals, but they're animals uniquely endowed with the capacity to recollect consciously, reason, deliberate, think about precedents, recollected, and take decisions. Only humans have moral agency, therefore only humans, as co-inhabitants of the natural world on planet Earth, with an astounding number of plants and animals, have the unique responsibility to look after that planet. But humans also have the capacity, because of their mental endowment, to cause terrible damage. As Aristotle himself wrote, drawing a chillingly true distinction, a bad man can do 10,000 times more harm than an animal. Aristotelian ethics thus, to me, provide a psychological platform on which to build environmental activism or green politics. They should be taught to all our children. And that's because these ethics construe human animals as part of nature, but at the same time as the only animal with the reason and ability to make moral decisions which makes them affect natural phenomena. For, he writes, as man is the best of animals when perfected, he's the worst of all when sundered from law and justice. For unrighteousness is most pernicious when possessed of weapons. And man is born possessing weapons for the use of wisdom and virtue, but it is possible to employ them entirely for opposite ends. Hence, when devoid of virtue, man with his weapons is the most unholy and savage of animals. Aristotle's contemporaries were uncertain as to the limits of the territory beyond what they'd already explored and had regular contact with. Although food was sometimes scarce, there was very little consciousness that anything provided by nature, timber, fish stocks, songbirds, mountain lions, new coastlines to colonize, might ever run out. Only in Aristotle's case do we catch prophetic glimpses of a developed ecological awareness. When he's didn't get to Lesbos. Where's my Lesbos picture? That was my Lesbos picture. It's all right. I'm going to stay there. When he's describing shellfish, we discover that in a lagoon on Lesbos, where he spent 2 years, a particular species of scallop, the red scallop, has been rendered extinct. It's been killed off completely, partly by drought, but he says partly by the dredging machine used in their capture. I believe that is the first reference in world literature to humans actually just wrecking another species. He also cites the destruction which can be caused by human interference with naturally occurring animal populations motivated by financial greed, and refers us to the man of Carpathos. This Carpathian tried to make money out of hare breeding and introduced the first pair onto the island of Carpathos. Carpathos was soon, of course, overrun with hares, which devastated its crops, vegetable beds, and plant ecology. And the destructive potential of farming as a form of interference in nature is something of which he's very aware. He actually says kitchen vegetables flourish better left to the elements than by artificial irrigation. He condemns human practices in the farming of animals, often as contrary to nature and pernicious. Some animal breeders, he says, used to make the young males of certain species breed with their own mothers. And the mother-son inbreeding was attempted either because the owners couldn't afford to hire a stud, or because the animals they possessed were regarded as particularly fine specimens with specific attributes they wanted to perpetuate. And sadly, this practice is not unknown amongst breeders of pedigree dogs today, although it's rightly regarded as genetically risky and highly abusive. Line breeding, where animals mate with very distant cousins, is much to be preferred. Now, Aristotle is in no doubt that animals don't want naturally to mate with their mothers, and he's collected examples of animals who have resisted Oedipulism. The male camel, he says, declines intercourse with its mother. If the keeper tries compulsion, he evinces disinclination. On one occasion, he says, when intercourse was being declined by the young male, the keeper covered over the mother, put the young male to her. But when, after the intercourse, the wrapping had been removed, though the operation was completed and couldn't be revoked, by and by, the young male bit his keeper to death. He studied horse rearing at close quarters. He reports that a young stallion, forced to impregnate his own mother, directed his violent response against himself like a tragic hero. The king of Scythia had a highly bred mare, and said that all her foals were splendid. Wishing to make the best of the young males with the mother, he had him brought to the stall. The young colt declined, but when the mother's head was concealed in a wrapper, he did in ignorance have intercourse. When the wrapper was removed, the young horse ran away and hurled himself down a precipice. This is tragedy affecting zoology. And the different methods of raising and feeding horses does seem to worry him enormously. He says they should be allowed to roam freely at pasture, which is where they remain free of disease, apart from an affliction of the hoof, which is in any case self-rectifying. But stables are breeding grounds for malnutrition, he says, and all forms of infection. Stall-reared horses are subject to very numerous forms of disease, one of which weakens the hind legs. And my sister, a horsewoman, says this is probably equine degenerative myencephalopathy. Aristotle can have known nothing about species resonance, yet he tells us an extraordinary occasion in 395 BC, when the ravens disappeared from southern Greece. A battle much further north resulted in a particularly high death toll. Now, ravens are opportunistic carrier birds, and he calmly infers from this that even across vast instances, these birds clearly have some means of intercommunicating with one another. And kindness to animals is always his recommended practice, as it is on the works on horses and dogs by another alumnus of the Academy, Xenophon. Just as in humans, when he knows that poverty is a direct cause of social conflict, Aristotle says that aggression in animals is linked to scarcity of food. And he says this is shown by the way animals are treated in Egypt, where they're very well fed in captivity, and they start to live peaceably side by side with each other. But most of all, he absolutely revels in cooperation between humans and animals. He records the history of Athens' most famous mule, who lived to the age of 80, so they said, at the time when the Parthenon was being built in the 430s BCE. Because of his great age, the mule was retired and no longer required to work, but it turned up every day to help drag burdens side by side with the others voluntarily and to encourage them. In consequence, he says, a public decree was passed forbidding any baker driving the creature away from his bread tray. And he has a very strong inkling of the superior intelligence of the dolphin, which scientists now believe really is a rival to intellectual capacity of humans. He tells of a shoal of dolphins which entered a harbour in Caria in southwest Turkey, remained there until a fisherman set free a dolphin from their community, which he'd caught in his net. He says female red deer are highly intelligent because he's noticed that they bring their fawns close to the size of public roads because the wild animals who prey on young deer are deterred from attacking them there through fear of the humans. And he tells of the cooperation between wolves and fishermen in the northeastern Black Sea by the Sea of Azov. Provided the fishermen divide their spoils with the wolves, all is well. But if they don't give them the fish, the wolves tear their nets into pieces as they lie drying on the shore. And a particular kind of fish he calls the anthos, he says, if it's present, is a sign that there are no dangerous creatures in the vicinity, and sponge divers can dive in safety. And the divers, he tells us, are so grateful to the anthias that they've called it the sacred fish and worship it. Now, I'm on to my conclusion. While any individual, all of us, can decide to try to be happy in our Aristotelian sense by implementing practical ethics and treating their community with respect, nobody, sadly, can make everyone else in their nation or on their planet do so too. Flourishing that encompasses whole communities, let alone the whole of the natural world, is a much more ambitious project that requires a global rethink of multilateral policies and of education. But Aristotle's rich ideal of a human community consisting of multiple friendships is still valid and inspiring today. And he also was very clear that many people aren't even in a position to worry about philosophy or politics or the environment. He recognized that humans as animals must prioritize the struggle to survive physically, just to get enough food and water and shelter, not to die next week, before they can enjoy the life lived self-consciously, aiming at individual and collective happiness. And he's very struck by the resilience humans can show in the face of the ceaseless struggle to obtain a livelihood. He'd have been the first to stress that anyone at this lecture is already privileged by having sufficient leisure left over after financing and preparing her family's meals to think about less basic imperatives. And I conclude by returning to the utopian tendency to Aristotle's thought. This was one reason why Thomas More wrote that Aristotle was the philosopher whom I love above all. And in his own Utopia, said that his radical traveller, Raphael Hythlodaeus, took several of Aristotle's books with him on his voyage of discovery. And Aristotle has been more recently recuperated in political theory with his idea that realizing full potential was the goal of human life. This is how you become happy, by realizing your potential. And potentiality, for which the Greek word is dunamis, is, I think, a deeply political issue, because it can help us think about the future, both of individuals and of the societies which we collectively constitute. Potentiality can help us try to bring imagined futures into reality. Aristotle would have called this to actualize them. It can help us even resist undesirable futures, theocracy, environmental pollution, or degenerate democracy. As we have seen, he even envisaged a world where machines could take over most manual labor, freeing humans to devote themselves more fully to the contemplative life. But the human race today, despite all our computers, nuclear and steam power, internal combustion engines, machines and robots, is still not exploiting its own intellectual potential. Many billions are not put in a situation where their mental dunamis is actualized by education. I was horrified last year by a survey in Britain which showed that more than a third of all British people think that their job that they do is completely pointless. The ecological and political challenges facing the human race have never been more acute, and yet we are, I believe, by no means nurturing all the aggregate brain power with which the human race alive today is endowed. Aristotle saw that human happiness is the universal human objective, and thus the project needs to be collective. The trust he felt in the general good sense of humanity even enabled him to find language in which to express his prototype of the modern idea of the smart mob. That is a group which, rather than behaving in the loutish manner associated with crowds, draws on universally distributed intelligence to behave with maximum efficiency. The idea introduced by Howard Rheingold in Smart Bobs in 2003 emerged from modern groups, which, through their quadratically increasing network links, can transmit and access information, actualizing the potential for collective intellectual work. And more than once in his treatises, Aristotle insists that all humans, not just trained philosophers, enjoy learning. Our potential collective intelligence, quite simply, is much greater than the sum of its parts. Now, did he personally regret the waste of human intellectual potential in a world where most people's dunamis, unlike his own, was never fully actualized? What we have of his views on education is just scattered in his ethical, political, and rhetorical works, in particular the 8th book of his Politics, which opens with the famous dictum, "None shall doubt that the legislator should direct his attention above all to the education of youth, for the neglect of education does harm to the Constitution." He means education at all levels, And he believes it to be of such fundamental importance to the flourishing of the community under any form of constitution that it must be publicly determined and can't possibly be left to be decided ad hoc by non-experts or by each parent. Since the goal of any city-state is to ensure that its citizens live the good life, he says, it's manifest that education should be one and the same at a certain level for all. And it should be public and not private, not at present, where everyone looks after his own children separately and gives it separate instruction of the sort which he thinks best. The training in things which are of common interest should be the same for all. Then he says, neither must we suppose that any one of the citizens belongs to himself. We all belong to the state, and each of them are a part of the state, and our welfare is inseparable from the welfare of the whole. Now, it's not that Aristotle asserts a one-size-fits-all curriculum for everyone, quite the opposite. He actually talks about how good teachers will very carefully assess the different needs of each child. But he is quite clear that the things of common interest are of public concern, and in our own society, I'd like to ask him what he thought the things of common interest with which all our young should be conversant are. And I think they would surely include all the socio-political, environmental problems which are becoming so urgent. He would insist that this education should be the same for all so that everyone in the community can understand the issues and engage in informed and fruitful dialogue with their fellow citizens. Universal education in the things which concern everyone would mean maximising the possibility of individuals with the relevant dunamis coming up with solutions to the problems facing everyone. The really able humans can appear in any community at any time in intelligence, and at any time. Intelligence really is randomly distributed. By failing to identify and actualize human intellectual potential, I believe we're placing shackles on our ankles at the starting line of our race against time. Surely we need to take the initiative and argue for an education for our fellow citizens and the global village, which is ethical and covers the things which are of common interest. And Aristotle would have agreed here with Dr. Martin Luther King, who expressed the idea of potentiality better than any modern politician I've encountered. On the 7th of January 1968, just a few weeks before he was murdered, he delivered a sermon at Ebenezer Baptist Church, Atlanta, which was entitled, "What are your New Year's resolutions?" And one of the things he said was this: I said to my children, I'm not going to work and do everything I can do to see that you get a good education. I am going to work and do everything I can to see you get a good education. I don't ever want you to forget there are millions of God's children who will not and cannot get a good education. I don't want you feeling you are better than they are, for you will never be what you ought to be. You will never achieve your dunamis until they are what they ought to be. And I really strongly believe that we cannot, as 21st centuries, fully achieve the actualization of our own dunamis until we make part of our work ensuring that everyone else on the planet is given the educational equipment and support that allows them to fulfill their potential as well. For we will never be fully what we ought to be until the human race can do so in its entirety. Thank you.
What did Aristotle think about the afterlife?
He didn't believe in it at all. In fact, some of his most moving writing is on a treatise called On Coming to Be and Passing Away. He personally did not believe it in full. He actually said it's impossible. But what's very moving about it is he says he knows that this feels unfriendly. He actually uses that word, not to do with the sort of loving relationships that he has been talking about to most people. He actually says that, and that he knows that this will be a tough one, and that the rituals which society has constructed for remembering, recollecting, and memorializing, if they make people feel better, fine. But he has certainly stared at the wall himself, and I think it's actually very inspiring, because he says everything is about life, everything is about being here and getting on and doing the very best. But because we are part of this continuous project, your contribution actually will not die if you make the most of it. So I find it very comforting. I was trying to finish this book. It's funny that first question should be this, because I was trying to finish this book last year in 2016. My own mother was dying. And I was writing this book about happiness, and I was absolutely miserable. And I wrote an awful lot of it at her bedside, but that's when I really found the recollection idea, disciplined recollection. And I just read this bit on Aristotle on all the different tricks you can use. You know, he's thought about it incredibly hard. And I went through, my mother was all up in tubes like this for months. It was horrible, but completely compos mentis behind them. And I sat and I for hours on end, from earliest memories I could, deliberately went through diaries and old photographs to remind myself and then her of the happiest times I'd ever had with her, just me and her, right? And I would just recite these, and it transformed the experience of those months. And I know from her responses that this was a very good thing to do. And because I've awakened them, I'm now feeding off them. I know she's dead as a doornail, but she's very much alive in my head because of disciplined recollection.
Aristotle didn't believe in a higher being. He didn't believe in a relationship. I mean, that's kind of the same question as the afterlife question.
Actually, he did. He did. He thought that there were sort of things out there living on distant planets. But he was absolutely clear that they had no interest whatsoever in human beings, and that we had to get on and make morality up for ourselves. And that expecting a providential deity to come in and kill the wicked and reward the good was just not ever going to happen. So you've got to get on with it yourself. I actually think later in life, and this is just a personal hunch, I mean, he did say that when he was very old, it's just a fragment. He died at 62, which was actually quite old, but he actually said, as I get older, I find the old myths and stories of more and more comfort. And I often wonder whether he's not thinking about the heroes meeting people in the underworld and so on. He also genuinely believed, he's so practicable, he genuinely believed that collective rituals are thoroughly healthy in a state. So you don't have to have a sort of metaphysical belief in the gods to see that doing religion together can be quite a good thing. I find this very comforting as certainly an agnostic, because I go to Anglican church sometimes. Actually, I wouldn't have been able to get babysitters for my children if I hadn't in my village. But we all know the distinction between the comfort that can come from rituals, even from another religion's rituals, and necessarily believing the whole metaphysical shebang, right? And so it's an incredibly practicable adult. I actually often the word adult is constantly, it's just grown-up philosophy. My Aristotelian man is Obama. He's a grown-up. He's a grown-up. Well, I think that the whole system, and there's only the tiny little bits of, that I think that it is a secular ethics and science and way of understanding the world, that people of any religion, provided they're not fanatics and think that the gods interfere in a daily way, is intensely practicable on a global level. I really, really do. So I may now sound a little bit of a proselyte myself, but he actually says the world would be a better place if everybody started thinking like this, and I think he was right.
So you've created this wonderful, vibrant, modern, contemporary Aristotle for us, which is thrilling. But can you talk about what happened to him in the Middle Ages?
I could.
That afterlife, when, certainly from the point of view, can say of early modernity, that all of a sudden Aristotle became this
rigid authority.
Poor man.
Poor man, exactly. So can you talk about that part of his
Not very
afterlife?
much, because I haven't researched Aquinas very much. It's not something on which I'm an expert. In fact, every time I try to read a book, I'm quite interested in Averroes and the sort of Arabic, the Arabic intellectual culture was extremely interested in Aristotelian science, and in fact, some of his treatises only exist through that whole tradition. That I can read about without going to sleep. When I'm asked to discuss sort of medieval scholastic uses of Aristotle beyond syllogisms, which logic is logic, and reasonably unideological. The organon, the reception of the organon is just good for argument, right? But beyond that, I fall so fast asleep I could never answer your question.
How was Aristotle viewed by the political and social leaders of his day? How did they view this philosophy? How did they view a man that's out there teaching and educating the common people in the community?
I don't know how common with the one. I mean, I don't know how you actually got into the Lyceum to one of his public lectures. So, you might have had. How did you guys get here? I don't know. I mean, it's like I don't. I'm not saying that every fisherman, from the Piraeus was going along. I'm saying he made the effort. And isn't it terrible we haven't got his own popular text? Because that would have meant, I think it's terrible. What was the question? Sorry.
How was he viewed by the social
Okay. Well, the amazing thing is that he managed to stay alive. Nobody who was hanging out in Macedon from the day he was born, his father was doctor to Amyntas, who was Philip's father. I mean, the murder level in the Macedonian court at any point in the 4th century was so extraordinary, and there was no democracy. It is incredible, and I suspect his heart sank enormously after his 20 years at the academy. He was 17 to 37 at the academy, when I think he was blissfully happy. And although Plato was often suspected of what we would call right-wing tendencies in Athens, there's no sense ever in anything that Aristotle was thought to share that. He then went off to a kingdom, interestingly, a friend of his, Hermias, who was a king of a kingdom near sort of northwest Asia Minor, northwest Turkey, Anatolia. And the ancient biographies say that he managed by counselling to get Hermias to lessen the despotic nature of his rule, which is actually very interesting, which implies a very, very persuasive moral presence. Then he went and did his zoological works with Theophrastus, and I think was incredibly happy for those 2 years on Lesbos. Then the letter came. Come back to Macedon, teach my brilliant son Alexander. And we're going to conquer the world, by the way. He went, he taught Alexander. I haven't really gone there. We do not know exactly how much influence he had on Alexander. People have speculated it ever since. All I can tell you is the minute Alexander crossed to Asia, the minute, straight back to Athens and founded the Lyceum, he was 49, with, I think, a huge exhalation of breath and relief. All right, he founded his own university, and for the last 12 years of his life, wrote everything. He was his own boss for the first time, really, in his life. He'd always been either under Plato or under Philip, or, do you know what I mean? And that's great. He's a great role model for people who even in their 40s, think they haven't done anything with their lives yet. He really is, because he's 49 before and he never loses sight of it. And he founds the university. Then, at the end, when the Athenians got conquered by the Macedonians, he was prosecuted because his links with Macedon were regarded as very sinister. He wasn't from Macedon, he was from this independent city-state also conquered by, called Stagira, also conquered. But he was driven out, he was prosecuted on grounds of impiety, which were trumped up, just like Socrates was, just like Socrates. Not being Socrates, he didn't say, well, I'm going to do a highly public and theatrical suicide for the job. I'm going to go and live at my rather nice family house on the island of Evia. Which was outside of the Macedonian, the Athenian control, and he did, but by the time he got there, we know he had this very bad stomach problem. He probably died of stomach cancer. But he did get into trouble at the end, but he did not die political death. And that implies he was both somebody who impressed everybody and that he was very canny. And just people like having him around.
Can you talk a little bit more about to what extent Aristotle's conception of happiness recognized what we might think of today as individual self-actuation versus a collective self-actuation, and is there really a close fit with the way we think of individual happiness nowadays, or was the classical sense of happiness more a collective sense that one would have within a patriarchal household or a polis?
It's a very American question, if you don't mind me saying so. Yes, you've got to self-actualize, but you cannot properly self-actualize except in partnerships. And you've got to cultivate those partnerships properly. So, for him, this idea of the sort of lone wolf out there being frightfully brilliant who needs no one would have baffled any ancient Greek, and it still would have baffled him. Self-actualization is through associations. You can't do it without. He's actually very, very interesting on marriage, and he hates adultery, which is so unusual for ancient Greeks. I mean, twice says, because it erodes this trust thing, which is so important, both, my relationship with you and with other citizens, that when you've got a whole society where trust is the dominant register. But he says that adultery completely erodes the fundamental association of the state, which is, as I say, not an ancient Greek position at all. He also talks an awful lot about how difficult it is if you really fancy your neighbour's wife, interestingly. So I've often wondered if that was his own personal, when he does the virtues and vices, he does use that particular example of the neighbour's wife. And you know that it's wrong, so you just don't do it because it will damage the trust with your wife, and then your whole household will collapse, and if your household collapses, then the state will collapse, and so on.
Edith, I wanted to go back to the scale of a community and Aristotle's anxiety about largeness, right, and population density. I mean, I'm thinking, apropos of your emphasis on contemporary crises and problems. We look around our country, and the large cities, the real population centers, are more tolerant, more cosmopolitan, more progressive, more blue, dare I say, than the small towns in this country by a very wide margin. I mean, that's a real divide. I would be suspicious of any scheme that says, as you have more population, larger units, that they become somehow intractable and problematic.
I absolutely agree with the point you raise. I'm not saying everybody ought to live in small ancient Greek city-states, and we ought to cull the population until till we get back there. Equally, though, the actual American democratic thing doesn't work. I mean, it seems to be quite clear at the moment that it's too big with too many very, very, very large just minorities. It's repeated. And it might be better if you all broke up into, if you defederalized again. All I'm saying is that these are, to me, the issues of common interest, which every school kid should have an hour or two to discuss. It's just like, how big can you go? Anthropologists will know far, far more about this than I do, but I've read recently the figure of 120 people as the most that can effectively work without you having to invent religion or collective ideas. We're talking about 30 or 40,000 BC, right? That 120 becomes the non-controllable by a patriarch, where you've got to have a system of ideas. And I certainly know from working in large educational institutions that there is a sort of limit in my head of about 300 people I can actually have any kind of how are you relationship that means anything. I mean, there are limits to these things which are worth discussing. That doesn't affect the idea that all the citizens of New York City might not have developed, and I'm always quite amazed when I go there. I know Philadelphia less well, might not have actually developed to what seems to me, certainly in Manhattan, a real trust relationship in some ways, that there is a level of what is the right thing to do that everybody seems to buy into, right? So, and that can exist, he says, under many different types of constitution. It's when that goes that you're lost. It's trust. And I'm fear what I see here at the moment on that, very much. General sense that there was a lady at the airport who told me to keep quiet because I was talking about gun control. She agreed, but she said, yeah, it's a provincial airport in the Midwest. That's awful if I can't speak up. I'm going to cut you off. So, he actually says bearing arms is a primitive thing we used to do.